Welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam. Today's episode is a special collaboration with Women.Connected, and it's a really critical conversation. The title of today's episode is Unspoken Truths: Sexual Harassment in the Legal Profession. The reality is that sexual harassment remains quite prevalent in the legal profession, despite long-standing efforts to stop it. A 2018 International Bar Association global survey found that out of the 7,000 responses it received, and those were across law firms, in-house and government lawyers, as well as the judiciary, 1 in 3 female respondents and 1 in 14 male respondents had been sexually harassed in the workplace. 70% of those targets did not report the incident, and 37% of the respondents who have been sexually harassed left or are considering leaving their workplaces. It's time we make the space to talk about this. With me is Kellie Kemp, co-chair of the Antitrust Law Section's Women.Connected committee. Kellie, thanks for letting us lend our platform to this discussion so we can all learn and do better as a community going forward.
Jana, thank you so much for having me. As you said, this issue remains quite prevalent, notwithstanding long-standing efforts to combat it. The American Bar Association's Commission on Women in the Profession has been trying to tackle this issue since at least 1992, when they set up a dedicated task force. As an aside, they have a lot of really helpful material, which we will talk about towards the later part of the program. In the meantime, it's important for all of us to recognize that this isn't just a women's issue. This is a profession-wide issue. Sexual harassment can cause significant injury to the individuals who are harassed, of course. That is pretty well accepted. But it can also cause injury to the companies and organizations where the harassers work or the harassment takes place. And it can cause harm to witnesses, bystanders, and other colleagues. Sexual harassers inhibit productivity, retention, advancement, and satisfaction in the workplace, and they inhibit our ability to utilize the full talents of everyone in the profession.
Before we go much further, I think it would be helpful to ground the conversation with some foundational definitions for everyone to be aware of. And here to help us with that is Jane Pigott. Jane is the managing director of the organization consulting firm R3 Group. Jane, what are we talking about when we say sexual harassment?
Sexual harassment comprises unwanted sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature in which any of these 3 conditions are met. 1, submission to such conduct is made either explicitly or implicitly a term or condition of the individual's employment. 2, submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used as a basis for employment decisions which affect that individual. 3, such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. This is the definition from the EEOC guidelines, which have been recognized by the ABA's Commission on Women in the Profession. Sexual harassment is illegal, and the employer is the one who faces the potential liability for sexual harassment when it occurs on the job. It's also a form of sexual discrimination that violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These are all definitions and explanations from the National Women's Law Center. In most cases of sexual harassment, the harasser is a man and the victim is a woman, but men can also be victims of sexual harassment. Sexual harassment also happens in the LGBTQIA+ community. Sexual harassment can happen between people of the same sex or people of different gender identities. I also want to define sexual predator because this liability for sexual predation lies with the individual predator and can be either civil or criminal. It also has led to actions for defamation when there is a denial publicly plus a adverse judgment on a civil or criminal case. It's led to defamation liability for the predator. A sexual predator is a person who uses their position of power in the workplace to exert control over others and make them feel that they have no choice but to comply with their demands. And so there is some overlap between the two. The differences are really who bears the liability if there is a civil or criminal judgment.
Thank you for that overview and covering both of those terms and the distinctions there. This behavior has been condemned, at least outwardly, right, for decades. Many forms of sexual harassment have been illegal since at least 1986, when the U.S. Supreme Court agreed that it violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's been the focus of countless awareness campaigns, funds, reports, and toolkits. Most companies and organizations now have some form of mandatory sexual harassment training. But the problem is that the conduct continues, and it's actually quite pervasive despite those longstanding and concerted efforts, and despite a lot of media attention generated by the Me Too movement in recent years.
That's exactly right. 2 years after the start of Me Too, in 2018, a global survey conducted by the International Bar Association, the same one that you mentioned, Jana, concluded that sexual harassment is ongoing, that it is chronically underreported, and it is prevalent in every area of the legal profession. The alarming thing is that instances of sexual harassment have pretty much remained the same for decades. An investigation conducted by the Harvard Business Review concluded that the number of women who have been sexually harassed has probably not changed since the 1980s. A 2020 survey conducted by the organization Women Lawyers on Guard similarly found that, for the legal profession specifically, instances of sexual harassment committed by partners and supervising attorneys have not abated over the last 30 years. The survey identified a spectrum of sexual misconduct and harassing behaviors that are ongoing, ranging from unconscionable to criminal. One participant in that survey revealed that she was raped by a board member of the organization where she worked. He was allowed to voluntarily resign from the board, but faced no other consequence, and she was expected to continue working with him in a professional capacity. Another participant revealed that she was invited to interview for a job by a male lawyer right out of law school, and early on in the job, he tried to get her to give him oral sex. I heard a story just the other day. A woman was talking to a group of women around a dinner table and asked the question, how prevalent do you think sexual harassment is? Do you think that it remains an issue in our profession? Every single woman said that she had been harassed 1 or 2 times, but that they didn't think it was a continuing issue in the profession. And the story made me so sad because it made me realize that this is something that women have continued to expect, that sexual harassment is something that we just accept as a part of our profession, that every single woman said she had been sexually harassed, but didn't think it was a common concern. This tells me that it's something that we've been conditioned to accept as a part of society and a part of our profession, that we shouldn't have to. So Jane, I'm curious, given your experience consulting on this issue in a variety of industries, do you think there is something about the legal profession that makes it more susceptible to sexual harassment?
Kellie, I agree with everything that you just said about the conditioning and the societal challenges that are reflected in this as a topic and why it is so persistent. As the National Women's Law Center has explained, and this is a quote, sexual harassment is an expression of power. It is used to reinforce cultural norms about appropriate roles, behavior, and work for women and men, and to exert control over people with less power and status in society and in the workplace, particularly women, women of color, immigrants, and LGBTQIA+ folks. A 2018 Harvard Business Review report focused on healthcare. And they found that many factors make an organization prone to sexual harassment: a hierarchical structure, a male-dominated environment, and a climate that tolerates transgressions, particularly when they are committed by those with power. As with the healthcare profession, the legal profession has all three of these elements. Legal organizations tend to operate in a very hierarchical manner, which can lead to imbalances of power. And lawyers in legal profession tend to work very long days and nights, sometimes on the road for a trial or a deposition or a hearing. Alcohol might be involved at the end of the day. And all of these things make the considerations more acute for the legal profession. An article that was published in the Atlantic magazine in 2017 and is still all too relevant today. After Jeff Price had resigned as the head of Amazon Studios amid sexual harassment allegations, and CEO Jeff Bezos had made no public comment, it looked at the three things that make organizations more prone to sexual harassment. And these are utterly applicable to the legal profession, but applicable across the board with all of the clients of the legal profession as well. One, hyper-masculine settings, which they defined as men are disproportionately represented in power roles. Two, a strong hierarchy, which they defined as a high degree of power imbalances where a single person can make or break the career of an individual. And three, a permissive organizational culture, which they defined as not a strong action or communication culture with regard to harassment. Anybody who's listening to this thinking about their own organization, they probably can identify all three of these traits in their organization.
Those dynamics you mentioned, Jane, those are really structures that put in place these settings that allow conduct like this to persist and create these incentives to shield an individual who sexually harasses others, right? And like you said, Kellie, it's incredibly sad that we've come to expect and seemingly have to accept and find ways to work around sexual harassment in our day-to-day professional lives. It also strikes me that there has been and continues to be a culture of silence around sexual harassment and misconduct in our society. Oftentimes you hear about this, quote, open secret, unquote, right? That seems to be a phrase that is repeated over and over again when these incidents come to light. Women and men are not encouraged to report sexual harassment. Worse than that, they're often ostracized and isolated when they do report. The Women Lawyers on Guard survey that you mentioned, Kellie, found that only 14% of incidents of sexual misconduct or harassment are actually reported. That, of course, means that 86% are not. And people who've experienced sexual harassment don't report it because the consequences for them are, or are perceived to be, worse than the potential consequences for their abuser. And I'm talking about consequences in both their professional and personal lives. And that means most victims of harassment are suffering in silence.
I myself have been the target of sexual harassment that I did not report. Many of us have been. When I was a second-year associate, I attended the Antitrust spring meeting with a number of my colleagues. One partner joined us. He wasn't in the antitrust group. He was a litigation partner that had been working with us on a few antitrust matters. I got to know him because I was the junior associate tasked with helping him defend an expert deposition on one of those matters. And at one of the cocktail parties, he became very drunk, and he began staring at my chest and repeatedly touching my shoulders and my waist. And finally, he grabbed me and said, "Let's get out of here. Let's go up to my hotel suite." The exchange was witnessed by a number of other attorneys, many of my fellow associates, but I did not report it, and I asked them not to report it because I did not want to be tagged as a troublemaker or a problem child, and I did not want people to associate that experience with me instead of the hard work that I was doing. And I believed that it was unlikely that he would be fired or disciplined for what he did, and if anything, I would be moved off the cases that I was working on, which I didn't want to have happen, so I did not report it, and I had to continue working with him for months.
I'm sorry, Kellie, is what I want to start with. And you underscore one of the sole reason for this podcast is that things need to change. And continuing in this way is just not acceptable for anybody, including all the organizations. It unfortunately is true that the sexual harasser is often not disciplined, and the targets of harassment face undue blowback. Reports have shown that this continues to be the case even in the post-Me Too world, which some people might find surprising. I think a lot of people think that the problem was solved. The HBR report that I mentioned earlier says that the evidence is unambiguous. Our current grievance system puts victims at a distinct disadvantage through unenforceable confidentiality rules, a high evidentiary bar, and punishments that leave harassers in place, including as superiors. Moreover, everybody knows that the system is rigged. That's why HR officers often counsel victims against filing grievances, and why studies show that only 1 in about 10 victims makes a formal complaint. Moreover, organizations are often reluctant or make an affirmative choice not to punish the perpetrator. The Women Lawyers on Guard survey that you both have mentioned, which is from 2020, found that 50% of reported cases, there were absolutely no consequences to the harasser. For some respondents, the conduct even got worse. The harassers often continued to work with, and some continued to harass those that were targeted. Harassers were often promoted or given additional managerial responsibilities and suffered few or no negative consequences, financial, supervisory roles, or otherwise. The ABA's Commission on Women in the Profession found that many survivors of sexual harassment may have been ostracized or faced retaliation. These negative outcomes are most likely to happen when the harasser is in a position of power at the organization that the victim is employed at. We need to understand that the culture of silence, both by the victim and the bystander, is real, and it exists because there is a fear of attribution and retribution. And that fear is material and very real.
I am so in awe of and inspired by women who do find the courage to say something at such personal and professional exposure. As many of our listeners will be aware, there are currently allegations that a former law professor and FTC Commissioner Josh Wright used his position of power in various settings to solicit sexual relationships and favors with his female law students, associates, interns, and job applicants over the course of the last 15 to 17 years. 8 women have now shared their stories about his conduct. Josh Wright filed a defamation lawsuit against 2 of them, seeking $108 million in damages. The 2 women have filed a counterclaim citing Virginia's anti-SLAPP statute, which is designated to deter frivolous SLAPP lawsuits brought for the improper purpose of harassing individuals who exercise their protected right to freedom of speech.
Yeah, Kellie, the community of women and men in our profession are really reeling in light of all this. Last year there was another case involving a defamation lawsuit that echoes some of these dynamics, and that was over in the natural science community. In December of 2022, details about biologist David Sabatini's resignation from MIT came to light, and that was after a leak happened of his former employer's investigation by an outside law firm into claims of abuse and misconduct. Sabatini was a world-renowned molecular biologist. He was a tenured professor at MIT, and he ran a major lab at the Whitehead Institute, where he oversaw researchers, postdocs, and technicians. He was predicted to win the Nobel Prize. He was placed on leave in August 2021, according to the reporting, after allegations that he fostered an environment in which sexualized and offensive behavior was rewarded, and that he engaged in a relationship with a fellow while serving as the director of the Whitehead Fellows Program. In the wake of this, it was reported that 3 senior MIT officials recommended revoking his tenure, finding that Sabatini violated MIT's workplace policy governing consensual sexual relationships. Sabatini then sued the Whitehead Institute, its director, and a junior colleague who had told investigators that he sexually harassed her, and he sued them for defamation. He called the Whitehead probe a sham and alleged that the junior colleague was out, quote, to punish an ex-lover, unquote. The junior colleague countersued, alleging 5 counts, including sexual harassment and retaliation. The suit is ongoing.
Josh Wright was also a tenured professor at George Mason University. To your earlier point, Jane, this issue of sexual harassment and sexual predation, it's not resolved even years after Me Too. Our listeners might remember that the economics world was rocked by a wave of sexual harassment allegations last year involving very senior economists. Among the various stories that were shared by women in the community, it was alleged that Philip Dybvig, the 2022 winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, had made unwelcome sexual advances to many of his female students. We talk about this on a prior episode of the podcast, in the episode called Where Are All the Women Economists from March 20, 2023, for anyone who is interested in that particular discussion. It's so incredible that it was just announced last week that the current Nobel Prize in Economics for this year is Professor Gladia Golden, whose work was done on women's issues, including the gender pay gap between women and men.
I love that. That's amazing. As we're talking about this, I want to take a step back because I think a lot of times we hear comments about, well, how does this happen, right? How do quote unquote educated women and men get themselves into these situations? Jane, can you tell us about the traits of sexual harassers and patterns that are often seen in sexual harassment and sexual predation? Are there behaviors that can help us identify it and combat it?
There are. And I'm going to rely on a Forbes article from March of 2021. And I specifically am using a business publication that was incredibly well researched, as opposed to an academic publication, because I want to underscore the fact that this is a persistent and prevalent issue in the business community. The article was called, "What Was He Thinking? Inside the Mind of a Sexual Harasser." And here are the traits of a person who uses sexual harassment as a tool of trade. 3 categories. First, psychological commonalities. 1, a lack of or limited empathy for others. 2, grandiosity, which they define as an elevated sense of self-importance. 3, omnipotence, which they define as an elevated sense of power and control. 4, an exaggerated need for admiration. And 5, poor impulse control. Except for the 5th criteria, the first 4 are also characteristics of highly narcissistic people. Second category is psychological factors. 1, disavowal, which you ignore information that you don't want to think about. 2, rationalization, you justify behavior that you know will be considered wrong. 3, excessive drinking. 4, overstimulation, which they define as high profile or high spotlight assignments or life. And 5, loneliness. The third category is social and environmental enhancers. First under that is a person who is surrounded by admirers and sycophants. 2, immersion in an environment that values power. And 3, there's no social mediators, which they defined as an organization that will not punish the behavior. So those are the characteristics. The tactics are all about power and control. And within the power and control, it's a quid pro quo system. If you do this, then I will do this for your career. Or if you do not do this, then I will punish you in this fashion. So consent is not possible. There's not a concept of consent under this power quid pro quo. And the victim knows that the bystander isn't going to act because of attribution and retribution fears, and that the organization is not going to punish in all likelihood. And so that makes the power even more complete.
That discussion of how consent is really beside the point is very important to keep in mind. And thank you for going over those characteristics that lend themselves to this behavior and those tactics, how it starts and progresses, that really show how a power dynamic can be abused in such a sinister way. What can we do to help the women and men? I'm thinking about the associates, the law students, the econ students, all those who are coming up behind us. How can we make the world, or at least our community as a start, a better place for practitioners?
I want to underscore the fact that one of the definitions of insanity is to expect different results and do the same things. So what this is going to entail is organizations and individuals deciding to do something different and acknowledging that otherwise we're going to be talking about this 10 years from now and have made no progress. Best practices. Effective training is great, but most organizations do training as a check the box exercise because their insurance companies demand it in order to maintain insurance. And so finding some metrics that allow for the effectiveness of the training to be measured would be important. The best written policy is worthless if there is no leadership at enforcing the policy and not a tone at the top that people will be rewarded for using the policy and ensuring that the organization is living its values on the sexual harassment front. Most organizations have fantastic state-of-the-art written policies that are not working. You need to ensure that reporting channels are easy, transparent, and trusted. And trusted is the key piece to this. You need to have, and in order to be trusted, you need to have people who are involved that are trusted by the people who are most likely to be victims. And you need to have a communication system that values closing the loop so that everybody is aware that the reporting system works for the people reporting, whether they are victims or bystanders. You need to have an organization that has a culture of zero tolerance with regard to harassment and predation. And that's a communication issue for the most part. There needs to be action, but the action cannot be in a way that most people are not aware of it. If there is action, it needs to be communicated to everybody. The system needs to promptly investigate and act on the results of the investigation. There needs to be an acknowledgement and a support system for the courage that it takes a victim or a bystander to report and put themselves at personal risk in doing so. Bystanders need to understand that they're part of the problem. You have three types of people. You have people who act, you have people who see something and choose not to act, and you have the people who are causing the problem themselves. If you don't choose to act, and that's the largest percent of people, then you're part of the problem. And so it needs to be safer for people to choose to act as bystanders. And the last thing that I would put out there as a best practice is that the lack of action by the organization is one of the key reasons why harassers believe they have the right to do this without any repercussions. And that needs to change. And there needs to be effective communication about the company's core values on this, not just what happened to the harasser.
Jane, so much of what you said resonates with me. For all of this to change, we need people in senior positions and positions of power to take a public and affirmative and very personal stand, to make very clear to their teams and their colleagues that they do not tolerate this conduct, and that if a report is made against someone, even if it's a very powerful someone, that it will be taken seriously and that the complainant will be protected. There is maybe some good news. While sexual harassment continues to plague workplaces, most people in the US believe that workplaces are less tolerant of harassment and abuse and more supportive of those who report these incidents than they were 5 years ago, according to a recent study by the Pew Research Center. 62% of people believe accusers are more likely to be believed than they were prior to the expansion of the Me Too movement. So opinion seems to be changing, at least. And it seems that we and future generations will only increasingly refuse to tolerate workplaces where sexual harassment and misconduct occurs, which gives me hope for the future. And we're not starting from scratch. There are tools that exist. We just need to make sure that we're using them. I mentioned at the outset that the ABA's Commission on Women in the Profession has put together really helpful materials for combating sexual harassment. A couple of years ago, they released the Zero Tolerance Toolkit, which has a lot of really incredible resources for law firms, corporate legal departments, bar associations, and other groups, including all of the materials needed to present a successful program, including customizable PowerPoints, a library of relevant scenarios for group exercises, and program handouts. You can tailor the program to any audience and, importantly, facilitate discussion of the bystander effect, which Jane mentioned. There are also resources to assist survivors of sexual harassment and abuse. Of course, the Women.Connected committee is also committed to combating sexual harassment in the legal profession and our community. We are working on programs and materials to increase awareness and provide support for survivors and witnesses. If you're interested in learning more or getting involved, please reach out to me, Kellie Kemp, or another co-chair or vice chair of the Women.Connected committee. Also, a plug. Every fall, Women.Connected hosts our annual Feminism, and it's coming up. This year, please join us on November 8th, Wednesday, from 5:30 to 7 p.m. at the JW Marriott in Washington, D.C., where we will honor Elise Dorsey and Angela Landry for their work as role models for women in the antitrust, consumer protection, and data privacy fields. And every year, the event is open to both men and women. We want and need our male allies to be a part of the conversation and the solution.
I think hope is the appropriate point for us to leave it for today. Thanks so much, Kellie and Jane, and thanks to our listeners for your time. I'm really glad to have such dedicated women bringing their experiences to bear and to help educate each other. It's conversations like these that can help on our path to making a difference, and that with action from those in our community can hopefully end the culture of silence. I'd ask our listeners to check out the resources we discussed. We always provide links on our Curious Amalgam's episode-specific website. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you tune in next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.